We come now to the book of Joshua. And before we really get into the book of Joshua itself, I want to say a little bit more about the Deuteronomistic history because now we begin that section. So I talked about this a little bit in the video on Deuteronomy, but now I want to get more into the Deuteronomistic history. Now, it's a very important thing that you be aware. The Deuteronomistic history does not include the book of Deuteronomy. I know that seems very counterintuitive, but and some scholars believe that at one time it did. That the history actually emerged first as its own running narrative from Deuteronomy through Kings, but at some point Deuteronomy got separated off and became part of the Pentateuch or the Torah, those first 5 books that are mostly about Moses, except for Genesis. But when we talk about the Deuteronomistic history, we are not actually talking about Deuteronomy, but about the historical books that are based on it, that view Israel's history through the lens of Deuteronomy. In Jewish tradition, these books are traditionally called the former prophets. Now, Christians, in Christian tradition, we usually refer to them as the historical books, or really this is part of the historical books. There are more than this, but these would all be historical books. But Judaism considers them prophets, even though they are very different from the latter prophets, books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Malachi, Hosea, which are the words of the prophets. The former prophets are narratives. They're stories, and there are some prophets in them, in particular in Samuel and Kings. But they would consider, Judaism considers these books to be prophets, even though they are not classical prophets, they're not oracles. We'll get to that in one of our, I think in the 7th module, we'll get to the prophets. What these books are, as the Deuteronomistic history, is they are a theological interpretation of Israel's history, and that theological interpretation is through the theology of the book of Deuteronomy. So they're going to evaluate Israel's faithfulness to the covenant, and in particular they're going to focus a lot on the kings and evaluating how well each king lives according to the rules of Deuteronomy. Because remember, Deuteronomy addressed kingship. There were rules governing the kings. And so things like, did they have a lot of wives? Did they marry foreigners? But also sort of the main Deuteronomic emphases of monolatry. Did they worship other gods? Did they promote the worship of other gods? And cultic centralization. Did they build up the high places, these other worship sites in various locations? Or did they centralize worship in Jerusalem? And the Deuteronomistic history ultimately ends in the failure of Israel to keep the covenant and the exiles. So the northern kingdom will be exiled in the 8th century, around the year 721 BC, and the southern kingdom, Judah, is exiled in the year 586 BC. Now, the main themes of the Deuteronomistic history are really kind of 3 of them here. The first is conquest, and so we're going to see that in Joshua and Judges are focused on Israel's entrance into the land of Canaan to take possession of it. So we call this the conquest and settlement, and the period up to the establishment of the monarchy. So there's at least a couple hundred years of rule by what we call judges. These are local charismatic leaders, and that'll be our next video. We'll look at that. But that's those 2 books. Then Samuel and Kings are concerned with the next 2 themes, which are the Davidic monarchy and the exile. So the Davidic monarchy, the kingdom of David, its rise is described in 1st and 2nd Samuel. That's where we meet David. And although once the kingdoms split, and this is after the reign of Solomon, the Davidic kings only rule in the south. The Deuteronomistic history seems to be written from a southern perspective because it continues on after the exile or after the split and goes all the way up to the exile of the southern kingdoms. And so that's the ending, is the exile. And but it's anticipated throughout. There are lots of warnings, even in as early as Joshua, warnings that Israel will probably break the covenant and will thus reap the curses, which include exile. So there are ominous warnings and foreshadows of the exile that is coming. We'll see this especially in Judges. This is a very dark and ominous book. Sometimes the Deuteronomistic history is referred to as part of what's called the primary history, which consists of everything from Genesis through 2 Kings. So it's the Pentateuch and the former prophets. And again, some scholars believe that originally Deuteronomy was part of or was appended to the Deuteronomistic history, and so you had a Tetrarch, which is 4 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and then you had Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic history. What we really have is a Pentateuch, 5 books, and the former prophets that would comprise the primary history. But it's the same books. It's just a matter of how you divide them up, how you look at them. Now, again, I touched on this with Deuteronomy, but when were these books written? When was the Deuteronomistic history written? Now, when we talk about the composition of Old Testament books, or really any books in the ancient Near East, it's very different from today. It's not like a Harry Potter book where, J.K. Rowling writes a book and it's a one-person project, and, well, she doesn't sit down and do it all at once. It's a unified project. In the ancient world, that's not how books generally were formed. In many ways, it was more of an edited work. And they used sources. So it's more like an anthology or a research paper maybe that uses an awful lot of sources. And you see this, the books sometimes refer to sources. So you see this a lot in the Deuteronomistic history, where at the end of a reign of a king, it will say things like, as for the other acts of King Manasseh, are they not recorded in the books of the annals of the kings of Judah? They're citing sources there, saying this is where I got my information from. You can go check the original source if you want. So, the books, especially Judges, I think, Judges seems to, like Genesis, very episodic in nature, drawing on local traditions about these judges, but it's assembling them later, putting the pieces together. Imagine, the analogy I usually use is of a brick wall. You see a brick wall. There's a difference between the age of the wall and the age of the bricks that it's built out of. You could, in theory, build a brand new wall out of very old bricks. You could reuse those bricks. You could tear down one building, pick up the bricks, build a new wall out of them. That's kind of what we're dealing with here, is there's a difference. The stories themselves, the raw material, may be very old. We talked about this with Exodus, about Exodus 15 being a very, very old poem. The same thing is true of Judges 5. This may be almost as old, if not as old. It's called the Song of Deborah. And it is extremely old, but may have only been incorporated into the book of Judges relatively late, depending on when you think Judges was actually written. And when it comes to the Deuteronomistic history, it may actually be even more complicated than that, because it may have taken shape in 2 stages. Because we find a mix of materials in the Deuteronomistic history. Some parts of it seem to have a very positive outlook. They are focused on the rise of the Davidic monarchy, the choice of God, that God chooses David as his anointed king, and in particular in 2 Samuel 7, this is the Davidic covenant, and God makes a promise to David that he will have an eternal dynasty, right? That there will always be one of his descendants sitting on the throne. that story is not likely to have been written or even chosen to include um, after the Babylonian exile, because after the exile, the Davidic monarchy is gone. It does not come back. It is destroyed in 586 and never returns. So that's it. Actually, it creates a theological problem, and we'll be discussing this later on. But we have these parts of the book that are very optimistic that God is with us. We are the chosen people, and in particular, the Davidites, the descendants of David, are chosen, and God will protect them and preserve that dynasty. And perhaps these sections were edited together into a history during maybe the reign of Josiah. Josiah, a Davidic king, in many ways portrayed as a new David, very similar to David. And perhaps this is being done to support his reforms, to encourage people to get their act together, to live like the covenant people, and to support God's anointed, which would be Josiah at that time. On the other hand, we have other strands, another layer of tradition here that is very, very negative, very pessimistic, that sees right from the outset that Israel is doomed to failure. Israel is doomed to end up in exile. You see this like in Joshua 24. He tells the people, you will not be able to obey this God. You are a rebellious people. So you're witnesses against yourselves. You have signed your own death warrant. So that seems to reflect the perspective of the exile, that they are looking back from the exile and trying to find answers for why did this happen. Because their thinking is, well, we're the chosen people. Why would God allow us to be destroyed? So it goes back into their own history and finds that they failed to keep the covenant. And so it's an answer to that question. Why did this happen? Now, turning to the book of Joshua specifically. So Joshua, if you'll remember from when we talked about Deuteronomy, and I think also when we're talking about Numbers, the refusal of the people to conquer the land and the spies, Joshua was one of those spies who had gone into the land in Numbers 13. And he was one of the two that had faith that God would give them victory. Joshua and Caleb were the disagreeing voices with the majority. And so Joshua is chosen as Moses' successor. And so we encounter him in Joshua 1. God speaks to him and says, my servant Moses is dead. Now you cross the Jordan, you and this people, into the land that I'm giving them. Every place where the sole of your foot treads, I have given to you. And he says to Joshua, no one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so also I will be with you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall put this people in possession of the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them. So Joshua is the new Moses. And he is encouraged to be sure to keep all the commands that Moses had given. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to act in accordance with all the law that my servant Moses commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, so that you may be successful wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to act in accordance with all that is written in it. So, if he will obey the Torah, God will give him victory. This is also instructional not only to Joshua, but this really speaks beyond the book of Joshua to all those readers. It's a warning that you need to keep the law, you need to keep the commandments, meditate upon it day and night so that you'll be prosperous. We'll come back to some of these themes later on in the wisdom literature about what does God expect of us, how do we live rightly, how do we live well. And one answer is obey the Torah, meditate upon the Torah. So Joshua is the new Moses. We see this illustrated very clearly in Joshua 3 when they arrive at the Jordan River and they're going to cross over into the land of Canaan. And they come to the river, and Joshua instructs the people, or the priests, to take the Ark of the Covenant and go stand in front of the people and step into the water. And it says, when you come to the edge of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan. And they do that. And when the soles of the feet of the priests who bear the ark of the Lord, the Lord of all the earth, rest in the waters of the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off. They shall stand in a single heap. And so they do that. The water is cut off and stands up still, and the people cross through on dry land. Now, does that remind you of anything else that we've talked about? Anything that happened earlier in the Old Testament? It's an awful lot like what happens in Exodus 14 with Moses and the Israelites at the Red Sea or Reed Sea, the Yam Suf, where Moses parts the waters and they cross through on dry land. So the parallel is not accidental. It's meant to illustrate that Joshua is the new Moses. He has the same authority as Moses, can do the same things as Moses. So the Israelites cross over into the land of Canaan. Now the first city that they come to, and they actually had sent spies there earlier, is the city of Jericho. Jericho is one of the oldest cities on earth, settled as early as about 9,000 BC. And that's the first city they come to. And they send some spies. They encounter a woman named Rahab. Now Rahab is a prostitute, and these spies take refuge in her home. They're hiding out there. But the people of Jericho have heard about the Israelites, and they see them camped out nearby. So they are looking for these spies, and they come to Rahab's house and ask her, "Hey, where are the spies? We thought they came in here." And she has hidden them. She put them up on the roof, and she lies and says, "Oh, they ran off that way. Go get them." And so as reward for her saving the spies, she has thrown her lot in with them. She's decided they're going to win. She sees that God is with them. And so she trusts in them. And because of that, they promise her that when the city is destroyed, she and her family will be spared. She lets them down out through the window. And they say, if you tie this red cord in your window, we'll know where you live, and we'll spare you and your family when we conquer the city. And that happens. So they've spied out the land. It's got huge walls. It's a strong city. But they come back to the camp, and here are the instructions that God gives, how they're to fight this war. For 7 days, they're going to march around the city in circles. All right? And on the 7th day, they're going to march around it 7 times. And on the 7th time, they're all supposed to shout and blow trumpets and make a bunch of noise. And so they do that. And when they shout and they make noise, the walls of the city collapse. And they march in and they take the city really without a fight, because the walls just collapse. And the only part that is left is the part where Rahab's house is. Her house was built into the wall. That's the only part of the city that survives. And they are given instructions to kill everything. All the people are to be killed except for Rahab and her family. All the people are to be killed. All the animals are to be killed. No one is supposed to take any of the treasures. They're supposed to be piled up in a heap and burned. This is a practice called cherem. Cherem means devotion to destruction, or it is the total annihilation of all living things in a city. And what it means, it's a holy war. It means you are sacrificing the city to God, and so everything has to be destroyed. They do that here in Jericho. They do it in 2 other cities as well, at least, in Ai and Hatzor. But then even throughout the rest of the book of Joshua, we read, there's summaries of these in chapters 9 through 12, where they conquer various cities, and time after time it says that Joshua left nothing that breathed, that he killed everything, he wiped out everyone. this is a problematic story for many people. This is theologically troublesome. So one of your paper on the divine warrior, this is one of the texts you can look at, this or the Exodus, to consider, why is God portrayed so violently here? Why does God order the death of every person, all the Canaanites? We have an idea of a just war, just war theory. Is one tenet of that is you don't kill civilians, minimize civilian casualties. So this is the difference between conventional warfare and terrorism. Terrorists target civilians; they just try to kill people. The military, in theory, is supposed to target military targets, but not civilians, not population centers. No, we don't always do that, but that's the way it's supposed to be. That's the idea of just war. Under no definition is what Joshua does here a just war. Other than that, it was commanded by God. So what I want you to consider in this paper is, why would God do that? What are the implications? What do we make of a God who in Exodus kills a lot of people, kills the firstborn of the Egyptians? Why doesn't he just kill Pharaoh? Why beat up on the Egyptians for all this time? Why does God harden Pharaoh's heart so that he can do these things? And then here in Joshua, we would call this genocide. What do we do with a portrayal of God as commanding genocide? So that's something to consider. It's not only, now there are questions, we're going to get to this in a second, about whether or not they actually did do that. There are reasons to believe that this is hyperbole, that this is the rhetoric of warfare, that they tended to exaggerate things. So when they say Joshua left nothing to breathe, we get to Judges, we find out actually there's still quite a bit breathing. They still have plenty of enemies in Judges. And some of the same cities that are said to be destroyed and that everyone is killed in Joshua are mentioned later in Judges, and they still have people in them after Joshua is gone. So it's rhetoric, common to the ancient Near East, that they would do this. In fact, the Israelites themselves, the earliest mention of Israel in a historical text is from an Egyptian stela from a king named Merneptah. And Merneptah is around 1209 BC, claims that he has completely destroyed Israel. He says his seed is not. They don't exist anymore. Obviously, that's not correct, but that's actually the first time Israel is mentioned. That's the beginning of their story historically, not the end. So he's clearly exaggerating. What do we, but that's really not the problem here. The problem is clearly the biblical writers portray God as having given that command and as it actually happening. So what do we do with that? That's for you to consider in that paper. Now, one of the other thing about Joshua is that this book, probably more than any other, has been brought into conversation with biblical archaeology, or with archaeological evidence on Israelite origins. And the reason is the one thing that archaeology is really, really good at identifying is destruction. I have a background in archaeology. I've done some archaeological work, and essentially what we look for are destruction layers. Israelite cities were built on these hills called tells. They were sort of mounds. If you've ever been to in Native American mounds, like for example in Cahokia, we have the Cahokia Mounds. They would build these mounds called tells, and they would build their cities on top of them. Now, they may start with a natural hill, but over time the tell grows, because when the city is invaded and conquered, it'll be destroyed most of the time. They'll knock the walls down, kind of pack everything down, and then they'll build a new city on top of it, so the tell gets bigger and bigger over time. What that does is it preserves each layer of destruction. It's kind of like, Pompeii, Mount Vesuvius, everything is buried in ash and preserved. Same kind of thing. The destruction and the leveling of the walls preserves the remains underneath it. So what archaeologists do, we dig down through those layers, and each time we come to a new stratum, a new layer, that marks a destruction of the city. And so it preserves sort of a snapshot of what that city looked like when it was destroyed. So archaeology is really good at identifying destruction. And here we have a story about an invasion of the Israelites destroying all these cities, conquering all these cities. So it invites archaeological investigation. And in fact, we have some. This slide number 8 here, you'll notice there's a dark layer between two lighter layers of rock or of soil. That is a cross-section of a site called Hatzor. Hatzor was one of the Canaanite cities. And Joshua describes that it was burned, that Joshua destroyed the city and burned it. And what we have there is a layer of ash that seems to confirm the story from Joshua. And in fact, archaeologists have dated this layer to about the time of Joshua, to the 13th century BC. So it seems that the city was in fact burned in the 13th century, which very well could have been done by Joshua. Now, it could have been done by a lot of other things too, but it does fit circumstantially the story of Joshua. This next slide here, you'll see these walls. These are the walls of Jericho. So you can see there are massive walls there. And in the 1920s, there was an archaeologist named John Gartstang who excavated Jericho, and he found these walls, and he dated them to the 15th century BC, which at that time was the favored date for the Exodus and conquest. Now, we discussed this back in the Exodus slide, or Exodus video, that there are two possible dates. One is in the 15th century, one is in the 13th century. He was going with the earlier date. And so thought, well, I found the walls that Joshua destroyed. The problem is that later in the 1960s, another archaeologist, Kathleen Kenyon, came through, and with a lot of archaeology had developed between those two excavations. She had a whole new method called the Wheeler-Kenyon method, where they make little squares and they excavate down all the way in a particular spot, but they don't uncover the whole city. And improved pottery typology. So the way archaeologists typically date sites is by pottery. They look at how pottery styles change over time, and they're able to come up with a relative chronology. And 40 years later, she has a much improved pottery typology of what the pottery looked like, and she redates that site. The walls that Gartstang found dated from before the time of Joshua. They were a couple centuries too early for Joshua, so Joshua couldn't have destroyed them. And in fact, Kenyon and those who have come after her have actually not found much evidence at all that Jericho even existed at the time of Joshua. It seems like it had been destroyed and abandoned. And so we've got a problem here. How does Joshua destroy a city that doesn't exist? So when we come to biblical archaeology today and trying to bring the Bible into conversation with archaeological evidence, it gets very dicey today. A lot of debate over whether the Bible is really supported or contradicted by archaeology. And so I want to look at 3 different models that have been proposed for the Exodus, or not the Exodus, the origins of Israel, for the conquest, so-called conquest. The first is what's called the conquest theory, and this is usually associated with a guy named William Albright, who was an archaeologist, an American archaeologist in the early 20th century. And Albright tended to believe that the Bible was more or less historically accurate, and he believed that the archaeological evidence of these destructions of these cities in the 13th century basically confirmed that, Israel emerged as a foreign invasion, unified, that came in and destroyed a bunch of cities in the 13th century. And again, this is earlier scholarship, and And so at that time, in the kind of early and mid 20th century, it seemed like the archaeological evidence really confirmed the perspective here in Joshua. Problem was that later on in the 60s, 70s, 80s, many of these sites were re-excavated and redated either earlier or later. So that one by one, the cities that are said to have been Joshua, no longer did the evidence seem to fit that account. And so today, the conquest theory is kind of a minority view. There are still some who hold to it, mostly more conservative evangelical scholars. Many would say, no, that we don't really have evidence that Israel emerged as a foreign invading army. We talked about some of this earlier on in Exodus, that in many ways Israel seems to have been very Canaanite, not to have been foreigners. So there are a couple other theories today. One is called the peaceful infiltration theory. And this was associated with a scholar named Martin Note, who believed that the Israelites largely came from pastoral nomads who peacefully and gradually settled in the land and built new settlements. They didn't conquer existing cities, but instead they built new cities out in the hills where no one was really living. And that this happened gradually over time. And there is some evidence to support this. Today, there's a scholar named Israel Finkelstein who holds to kind of a modified view of this theory, that if you look over the long-term history of the Middle East, you see a cycle, a pattern, in which people will settle down and adopt sedentary life. They'll build villages, they'll start farming, and then eventually living in cities, urbanism. And then some sort of a social crisis. Something will happen, and for some reason they will abandon settled life, and they will revert to being shepherds, pastoralists. They'll live in tents out in the desert and move around from place to place. There's a cycle of settlement patterns between those two lifestyles. And that what we see with Israel is simply a part of that cycle, that you've got pastoralists, nomads living out in the desert in tents, who around in the late 13th century cross over the Jordan River and gradually begin to settle and build permanent settlements, villages in the hill country of central Israel. But it's not a unified invasion. Another view is called the Peasant Revolt, and this kind of blends some elements of both of those views. It's with the peaceful infiltration, it shares the idea that essentially the Israelites were of Canaanite origin. They were the peasants, the underclass that had lived in the Canaanite cities. What it shares with the conquest theory is that there is war. But the way it happens is that you've got oppressed peasants who eventually rise up in revolt against their aristocratic lords. This is a very Marxist, very Marxist view. It's class revolt. It's class warfare, and so they do attack. They do destroy some cities, but they don't settle in those cities. They go up and they settle in the hill country and they establish sort of a utopian society. This view is associated with George Mendenhall and Norman Gottwald. Today, actually, all three of these theories are kind of old and outdated. Today, there's a lot of blending of different views. We talked about the mixed multitude back in the Exodus video, that Israel probably didn't all come from one place, that there probably were some escaped slaves from Egypt. There was a core group of Israel, that the descendants of the ancestors who were slaves in Egypt and came and escaped and maybe did invade and destroy some cities. That there are other elements that seem like there were other people who joined themselves. So we see in the book of Ruth, for example, which we'll look at in this module, is the story of a Moabite woman who joins herself to Israel and becomes an Israelite. And we see this continuing in later periods as well. Foreigners who join themselves to Israel begin to worship the Israelite God. So they are a mixed multitude. So this is kind of an open question today. Archaeologists debating whether or not the evidence supports this idea of a unified conquest. Now, where do we come down on this? Well, a lot of it depends on what your views on the Bible are. If you believe the Bible is the Word of God, if you believe that the Bible, is truth, then you're likely to say, well, there has to at least be some element of history here. You can allow that there may be hyperbole, that, again, when it says Joshua destroyed everything that breathed, and yet later in Judges there are still quite a few people breathing. You can say, well, Joshua is speaking the language of military rhetoric of the ancient Near East, that they would often exaggerate how many people they killed, and so he's just, that's the way people spoke. We do the same thing today. If you're a sports fan, you might say, oh, we destroyed them. Well, did you literally destroy them? I hope not. But you're speaking figuratively, and it may be much the same here. At the same time, something had to have happened. And so my view, I think something happened. I think there was a conquest, but I also do think that you have to be aware of the rhetoric issues, and that it may not have been as massive as the Sunday school version, sort of a literal reading here would come away with. But those are all issues that archaeologists debate today. The last thing I want to mention here before we end our look at Joshua is the ending of Joshua. So after the narrative of the conquest, and then they divide up the land into tribal allotments, there is a covenant renewal ceremony in Joshua 23 and 24, where, reflecting upon what has happened, Joshua renews the covenant. So just like we had in Deuteronomy, a renewal of the covenant, now, having conquered the land, they renew it again. And again, there are ominous warnings here about what the people will do. There are warnings against things they're not supposed to do. One of these is they're not supposed to intermarry with Canaanites. So in chapter 23, again, warnings about don't depart from the law, don't turn aside to the right or the left, and don't be mixed with the nations left here among you, or make mention of the names of their gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow down yourselves to them. So there's a correlation between intermarriage or mixing with these people and worshiping their gods, because he says, if you intermarry with them, you will be led astray. They will become a snare and a trap for you. All right, they'll lead you to worship their gods, and in fact, that is exactly what happens. There are warnings that if they do these things, they will lose the land. So this is chapter 23, verse 16. If you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he enjoined on you, and go and serve other gods, and bow down to them, then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and you shall perish quickly from the good land that he has given you. Again, Deuteronomic theology. God owns the land. If you break the covenant, you lose the right to live in it. And finally, Joshua himself predicts that they will fail. At the end here, he puts a charge to the people. Will you choose who you will serve? Will you serve the Lord? And the people say, yes, we will serve the Lord. And Joshua doesn't buy it. He says, you cannot serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he will turn and do you harm and consume you after having done you good. So he warns them, I don't think you can do this. The people say, no, we will serve the Lord. Then Joshua says, you are witnesses against yourselves. He's invoking witnesses. Just remember the covenant treaty, the treaty format. He invokes witnesses. You yourselves are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord to serve him. And they say, we are witnesses. And then he tells them, oh, then put away your foreign gods. Don't worship your other gods. This is setting you up for a big I told you so. so that when the exile happens, you can point back to this and say, I told you so. Look, you took this upon yourselves, and so you have no one else to blame. So Joshua is a mixed bag of this very optimistic, yay, we conquered the land, God gave us victory, the walls of Jericho fell, Joshua left nothing that breathed, even hyperbole, exaggeration type of positivity, with this somber foreshadowing and anticipation of exile. And we'll see that increased even more so in the book of Joshua, or in the book of Judges, which follows.